Before I start, I need to introduce you to my friends. I'm no friend. That's right. I chose my words carefully. On the right, Ned Norton, who was here yesterday and is well known to the forum, but was quite heavily involved in science delivery in the Selwyn-Waihora zone. Next to Ned is Dr. David Painter, who many of you will know anyway. David's got a long history in water resource management as an engineer and an academic, but was for 4 years on the zone committee, and I thought it would actually be really useful, instead of kind of just talking about it, actually getting somebody who's lived it to make some observations towards the end when we have that opportunity. And David Perenara O'Connell, who's also very well known to the forum, and was also involved in the Selwyn-Waihora process, wearing a number of non-conflicting hats, I suspect. But I'll invite David to make some comments when we talk about iwi aspirations and the relationship to the process. So, anyway, here's the first slide. This gives you actually this is the catchment. This is an aerial photograph taken about just above the northwestern shore of Waihora. Waihora sits at the bottom of this catchment. It's an absolutely pivotal water resource. It goes right to the heart of Ngāi Tahu identity and tikanga, incredibly important. And then you've got this this vast sweep of Canterbury Plains up to the foothills. The catchment's about 200,000 hectares, something of that order. And the lake's about 20,000 hectares, depending on how full it is. Actually, when it's full, it's New Zealand's 5th largest lake by area. Land use, well, obviously dominantly agricultural. About 60,000 people live in the catchment, but agriculture is an incredibly important part of the zone's GDP. About 50% sheep and beef and arable, 25% and growing, dairy, and a bunch of other bits and pieces to make up the final 25%. Now, before I actually start, I want to offer what is really a thumping great qualifier in all of this. It was suggested at one stage that this was being put up as some kind of exemplar in terms of limit setting process, and I wanted to disabuse you of that. This is not the way, the truth and the light. It's a small piece of the journey that the Selwyn-Waihora community has gone through, and it is now at a staging point in that journey. This isn't an exemplar, it isn't a template, it's not a recipe, it's what we've done. This process was informed by the lessons we learnt from earlier processes, and hopefully the mistakes we've made in Selwyn-Waihora will help inform and improve processes elsewhere in the region and potentially in the country. The other thing I wanted to say is it's my ambition in this presentation to present you with no new information at all. I'm hoping that there'll be no insights because they've been delivered pretty much through everything that's been said over the last day and a half, which I found incredibly enjoyable, but slightly frustrating when my gems were preempted. However, I do hope that at least in a sense, some of this will be affirming, because you will hear things, good things, I hope, that have been done elsewhere. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, I was watching the cricket on Sunday night, actually, and I was looking for displacement activities, and I thought, well, I wonder if I could construct this presentation around the letter C, which is kind of like a Sesame Street moment, I think, sort of in a subliminal sense. It hasn't entirely worked. And the more wakeful of you will notice that the conclusion comes about a third of the way into the presentation. I'll explain when I get there. Okay, just bear with me. Okay, so first I want to spend a little time giving you some context, because this is a process that's been going for quite a while, and I also think it's worth reflecting on the history of limit setting processes elsewhere in the country. The starting point is this thing called the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, which lots of you have heard about. John Bright mentioned the Canterbury Strategic Water Study earlier on. That was kind of the biological parent of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, not necessarily fully acknowledged, but the point is it's been a long discussion about the ways that Canterbury should manage its water, and the starting point for that discussion was actually a discussion around how much we had and how we could exploit it further. And as the community got into that discussion, they really realised that there was a much richer vein that needed to be tapped in terms of what a social licence might look like. So the strategy was born. It's got these parallel streams around water development, efficiency and ecosystem restoration and repair, and in no place is that more relevant than in Selwyn-Waihora. Collaboration is obviously a very strong theme, and it is enshrined in the ECAN legislation, which I'll just mention very briefly because it's one of our little points of difference down there. But also the strategy predates things like the MPS in terms of its requirement to set targets and limits. So just in a nutshell, regions divided into 10 zones, a bit like the Wellington region's Whaitu, 5, 10, much the same I suppose, given the size of the region. They're probably similar geographically in terms of their area. Selwyn-Waihora is that one there. It should be blue. Well, yes, it is. That's good on that map. Each of those zones has its own zone committee. They do a lot actually, the Selwyn-Waihora committee, but they did perk up a bit as we got further on into the process. Representation, which has been a hot topic of discussion. Governance representation from both the Regional Council and the relevant TAs. Runanga membership is central, and in the case of this zone committee we have 6 Runanga reps because of the special relationship that a large number of the Runanga have with the lake. And then community members, and David was one of those who were appointed in the same manner that Alistair described earlier on this morning. But that point that those committee members need to be able to demonstrate that special relationship with the zone is important. Now, an added kind of complexity in this mix is that our governors, the commissioners, and Ngāi Tahu entered into a co-governance arrangement several years ago, specifically in respect of Waihora and its catchment. And that was really an agreement to work in partnership, but it kind of raises some interesting questions around the relationship between the aspirations of co-governors and the aspirations of the zone committee and how they fit. Now that is dealt with in a fairly pragmatic sort of a way, in as much as that we have common membership between the two, both the zone committee and the co-governance board, or certainly did have. And it's also wrapped up in the importance of making sure that the co-governance vision, or that sort of suite of aspirations for the lake and the catchment, align really closely with the zone committees, and having that common membership, I think, and allowed us to sort of share that in a very useful way. That said, it's still a relationship that has to be managed very, very carefully. It's challenging. It's also been fairly exciting from my point of view. One of the things that we said in that co-governance relationship is that we would share drafting of the RMA part of our plan for the catchment. Perhaps more honoured in the breach than the observance, as it turned out, but that had more to do, I think, with capacity than it did with intention. Okay, now there's this other thing. 2009, this thing happened to us at Environment Canterbury, and you'll see that document on the right, which I guess probably one of the most insightful and well-crafted pieces of organisational analysis that the government produced that afternoon. What it meant was that there were some major changes took place in Environment Canterbury, and we had the appointment of commissioners, and we had new powers under our own piece of legislation. And I think it would be fair to say that those new powers, particularly the powers in relation to appeals to the Environment Court, have been instrumental in driving some of the achievements in the Canterbury Water Management Strategy because it's changed the way people have worked. And it was one of the useful things also about the legislation was that it gave particular weight to the strategy and its principles. Anyway, we move on as we always do from these things. I wanted to just say a bit about limit setting in a national context and simply make the point that, you know, some of my colleagues have said, oh, that MPS for freshwater management, that's changed the world. Some of them think it's actually ended the world. But the point is that limit setting's been part of our mandate and our activities for quite some time, and you can see a range of processes that have been going for the best part of 10 years in different parts of the country. And the thing about, if you look at those processes, many of them have differences in the way they've been approached, but there are some kind of underpinning themes which are important then and remain important now. And I don't want to sort of go through any of these in any great detail, but maybe just highlight the importance of things like the iwi worldview, like the importance of predictive models, which has been an important part of this morning's discussion, like the importance of good management practice, which I'll be saying a bit about later on. So those are themes that I think are permeating all of these processes and the solutions that are arising through these processes. So let's go back to Selwyn-Waihora. Here's the Selwyn-Waihora zone, and you will notice, you geographers, that this actually extends right up into the Southern Alps, and it includes the upper catchment of the Waimakariri River, which you mightn't think naturally falls into the Selwyn-Waihora zone. When we set up our zone boundaries, we were looking at two things, a kind of a hydrological coherence and a social one. So administrative boundaries became important in the way we designed our zones, and that's why you see the Selwyn District Council includes that area to the north of the Selwyn catchment. The bit that we've actually been working on is this bit here, which is a subset of that, and that's the 200,000 hectares I was talking about earlier. So from the foothills out to the coast, but with that all-important lake at the bottom. If you were looking for context around the kinds of issues that we asked the Zone Committee to look at, they're summarised in this slide, which is one of those A3s that decision makers like, and it's not just cabinet ministers, got some commissioners that quite like them too. But essentially, I mean, you'll be familiar with the issues that we had there: declining water quality, declining water volume, the importance of agriculture to the economy, but impacts on allocation, the health of the lake, disputes over water that have been raging for about 10 years. So this is kind of a massive hospital pass to the Zone Committee, but with some tools to help them navigate. And the next thing I want to talk about really, carrying on with the C theme, the bits that we had to put together, if you like, to design something that would work for Selwyn-Waihora. So the components of the system, and we're really talking about the sort of stuff that we've been talking over the last couple of days, the sciencey bits, the social science bits, and how they join together. So what this is here is kind of a, no, it's not really a road map. It's a diagram, and I'm sorry, it's just another diagram. But we have attempted to simplify this. It identifies the bits, the components of the knowledge system that we needed to join up to be able to develop a solutions package for the zone. So those bits you can see there are, if you like, the biophysical bits, lakes, streams and groundwater. And you add on to those social, cultural, economic, and then these other bits which we need to understand if we're going to be able to introduce an appropriate suite of mitigations of the catchment. So those are things like on and off activities. We call them bolt-ons there. Social and economic assessment was a critical part of this. And Graham was talking about science and regional council. Social science isn't a strong suit for regional councils by any means. This is a set of skills and knowledge that we have to bring into the process. Social impact assessment, in fact, was really something quite new to us in terms of policy development, beyond ticking Section 32 boxes, which councils have done in the past. And also the economic analysis, because we knew that if we were going to get solutions that reflected community values in Selwyn-Waihora, we were going to be asking a lot of people. We were going to be asking some people to make significant sacrifices, so we had to be able to understand what they were, and we had to be able to explain them and quantify them. So economic analysis was a critical part of that. And I mentioned the fundamental importance of the lake to Ngāi Tahu. So cultural considerations were paramount also. And I just wanted to mention a little tool here called COMAR. And David, you'll tell us what that stands for?
Cultural opportunity.
Oh, you will. Yeah, of course you read it off the slide. But I couldn't read it on my screen here. So this is kind of a tool where iwi could themselves identify Mahinga Kai sites, other cultural sites of significance that were important to them, and they could kind of assess their state and monitor change. So that's kind of an enduring tool that we will continue to use through the implementation of the plan. Just want to say a bit about the kind of biophysical side of limit setting, but I wanted to make the point that, if you're going to set limits, you actually have to understand what you're dealing with. You've got to quantify sources. And it's interesting that the National Policy Statement includes a requirement for catchment accounting for contaminants and water quantity. In a sense, it's kind of a redundant provision, because if you're going to set limits, you need to go through that exercise. You need to understand what you've got, and you also need to understand how those things might change as practices change. But it means you go through almost a hesitate to say this is sequential, but I guess it's part of the process where one bit does follow the other, where there are a number of things you have to do, starting with developing a good conceptual model of the catchment, understanding the bits of land information that Linda talked about, land and soils, drainage, those sorts of things, what's happening on the land, what's your mix of land use, what can you expect in terms of drainage and loss. And I may take the opportunity to say a bit about overseer later on, Alistair, if I've still got time, because it's kind of central to all of this too. So just to see what that looks like, the conceptual model, okay, I mean all this is, and it's really critical, is an agreed understanding as to how the system works. It's not a quantitative thing, it's not numerical, but it's an appreciation of what the relationships between the hydrological parts are, what the lag times are. In general terms, what happens if you drop a bit of nitrogen at the top end of the catchment? Where does it pop out again, and how long does it take to get there? What's the basic understanding of the way everything's wired? And it seems to me, this is an observation made in ignorance really, but it seems to me that the most sort of acrimonious disputes that we fought in the water wars in Canterbury, as we now call them rather quaintly, were disputes over the conceptual model, fundamental disagreements as to how the system worked. And that if you can get agreement on that, then which numerical model you use to start quantifying bits and pieces becomes relatively less important. If you haven't got the conceptual model right at the start, you're doomed to repeating a cycle of disagreement and dispute. Linda showed this great picture yesterday of a satellite image in which you could actually see at paddock scale what the different land uses were. We didn't have that available for us in Selwyn-Waihora, although we have in subsequent processes and will in the future. You can see there, if you're interested in the kind of general pattern, and this is at farm scale, it's generated through Agribase. The orange and red bits are dairy farming, so you can see there's kind of a dominance of dairying in the sort of the left-hand part of that picture, or the southwest. And the purple and green bits are sheep and beef and arable. And closer to Christchurch, you get a proliferation of lifestyle blocks. that information is critical, because you add that to this thing, which is the soil drainage characteristics. Now, this is one of the things that Linda showed us yesterday. This tells us about the soils in the catchment and how good they are at retaining moisture, and therefore how leaching occurs, or how rapidly it occurs. So kind of critical. So you superimpose that on your land use map, and then you take this thing here. This is what's in the trade known as a lookup table, and this is, if you like, a very crude version of the MGM that Linda also talked about yesterday, the matrix of good management, which will look something like a huge version of this, where you have a bunch of land uses and a bunch of soil types and other pieces of environmental information like climate, for example, and then associated with each of those combinations is a leaching rate. So you take that information, you add that to your land use information and your soils, and you can actually derive a loading figure for the catchment. So that's all I wanted to say about the components. Now I've got to the end. It's great. The conclusions that I'm talking about, there's only a couple of slides here, are the conclusions that the Zone Committee got to when they processed all this information. So this is a summary of their so-called ZIP addendum. Now, we heard about ZIPs and WIPs before. The ZIP is our Zone Implementation Plan. Each Zone Committee produces one of those. That's really kind of an aspirational statement about what they want to achieve. The addendum is the translation of that into what effectively become drafting instructions for the council. So in a sense, the planner holds the pen, but there are 14 pairs of hands at their elbow. So you'll see down the left-hand side a bunch of goals, some processes in the middle, and then what we want it to look like at the end. Another way of summarising that is this kind of diagram, which is a kind of a subset of the what we call the solutions package, and in that this is focusing particularly on farm interventions, but there's a whole bunch of stuff around constraints on land use, on nutrient discharge allowances, on revisiting flows in rivers, managing water allocation differently, exclusion of stock, a whole bunch of things around that. Sorry, what's that, Chris?
Just excluding CPW.
Okay, so what that meant was sitting waiting final decision is something called variation 1, and that's variation 1 to our regional land and water plan. That will be the first variation of about 6 or 7 because the Hiranui sub-regional plan predated the land and water plan, so it's variation 1. I guess the most important thing I wanted to say about that is the last bullet point, and that is that plan will not itself achieve all of the outcomes that the Zone Committee wants, not by a long way. This is a really complicated, difficult package. It will certainly go some way, but it's reliant on an ongoing program of intervention. And we'll come back to that, I think, in our discussion. Okay. What I really sort of wanted to talk about was sort of some of the concepts that we're developing in this process and the things that we're learning from those, some new ways of working, I suppose. Right, now, I used to be a matter of honour for me that I'd never put up a slide that people at the back couldn't read. Now it's a matter of honour that I'll never apologise for it. What I'm going to do is take you around these two cycles of process, which and I'm going to start up here, right? So the whole point about this diagram is that you're seeing what's going on in the Zone Committee and the community, but you're also getting a sense of what are the constraints, what are the influences from the outside world. You know, where does the RMA process come in? And I wanted to make the point that this isn't a zero-sum game. You know, we've got constraints or opportunities, or whatever you want to call them, that are determined at a national and a regional level that are impacting on where that Zone Committee goes. But the starting point, that the circle right at the top actually says priority outcomes. Those are the things that are set out in the Zone Implementation Program. As we move around clockwise, the next one says establishment of nodes and identifying scenarios for analysis. So if you like, the nodes is kind of the spatial location of the outcomes, where you're going to measure those things that are important to you. The scenarios are what are the, I love that expression, plausible futures that the community is interested in exploring. The next stage is the detailed social, economic, cultural and ecological analysis of those. Then you move down to on-farm options, feasibility, financial analysis. And then you go into, when you've got that bunch of information, you go into something that we call the deliberation process, which is quite a complex and rich process where the impacts of those things are discussed and debated within the community. When you've done that, you move into establishing objectives and limits phase. But the point about the rather bold headline is that this isn't a linear process, and I think that's one of the big mind shifts for us as bureaucrats. Is actually getting that out of our heads. This is actually about a process that cycles, and not always in the same direction, but it is certainly iterative. And you revisit these things as you understand the connections and the consequences. The bottom circle, which is what we call the managing to limits part, is where, when having set the limits, where we go. But they're interconnected. The top box there says, well, what are the management objectives given those limits? How are we going to manage the resource? Moving around again clockwise, what are the implementation mechanisms that will help us get there? What does that mean in terms of farm planning or planning at the catchment level? What are the things that we can do as a community? These might be non-regulatory things, but on farm and as a community. Then, of course, the monitoring and review component, so that goes around. But the consequences of what happens when you're managing to limits also feed through into what you're doing when you're setting limits. They are interdependent. Okay, now I'm hoping you can read this one, because this is kind of core. Right, okay. What this is a kind of a roadmap of process that starts with the scenario exploration phase and ends with an agreement on limits. So imagine that roughly the time is passing from left to right in this diagram. Along the top we have a series of activities. They start with, if you like, the identification of development scenarios, technical assessments, a deliberation process and the development of an agreed limit. And then down the vertical axis we have the groups that are involved, and they're identified there as a zone committee, focus groups, a technical group, which is your science leadership group, and facilitators. And I guess I want to say that we used focus groups in the Selwyn-Waihora zone because we really needed to extend the direct engagement right into the community. So a group of 14 and effectively became a group of 100, maybe a few less than 100. Now, those focus groups met collectively for nearly a year, quite frequently. They looked at values values and impacts from their own position or from their sector position, but they were engaging in a process of dialogue with everyone else. And at the same time, we ran a bunch of, I guess what you'd call them science clinics, where anyone could go along and essentially have a one-on-one with the technical specialists or the things that they needed explaining. I'm not sure that we've got the model for this quite right yet, but it certainly worked pretty well. Not everybody availed themselves of that opportunity, but we saw it as fairly important to extend that opportunity anyway. Okay, so what are we learning about ourselves and what we need to do differently? Which I've called competencies, of course. Well, every morning, just after Dame Margaret's taken us through our corporate star jumps, we repeat this mantra. We've heard this before today and yesterday, but you know, it bears repeating that process, deciding the capacity for resource use is informed by science. but it can't be led by it. So along the way, we've kind of developed our thinking around the importance for scientists of a role as integrators and translators at the interface between community and decision makers. And it's kind of critical, and there are a couple of concepts that are relatively new that I thought were words for the feeble-minded, but they kind of, I realise that they're kind of important now. And one is this this concept of the socio-hydrological system, the recognition that not only is the biophysical world fundamentally connected, but so it is with the social and cultural and economic worlds. You know, you can't think about how the hydrological system works in the real world without thinking about economic implications. You can't think about cultural ones without thinking about water quality. You've got to keep it all together. And then this idea of disciplinarity, or transdisciplinary, I suppose. I don't even know if it's in the dictionary, but it's a heck of a good word, because we've used, I guess, in regional councils and in CRIs, we've been used to working in a multidisciplinary way over the years, where we have teams with a mix of expertise and experience. But this idea of transdisciplinary takes that a step further. It's actually getting the knowledge team, the knowledge brokers, as John called them, to actually experience each other's world as well, to understand themselves, how the parts connect together. I actually think it's incredibly important for these processes to work well, if people can understand those connections. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're a modeller, you need to become an expert in microbiology, but you've got to kind of understand the language and know where your discipline connects with that one. So that's really important. And it means, if you sum it up, that it's a new way of working and thinking for us. It's around our ability to provide a framework through which community discussion and debate can take place. I've made some comments there about it being agenda-free and so forth, but that last point is really important, this communicate uncertainty. Now, you'll be sick of people banging on about uncertainty, I'm sure, but, there it is. Look at the acronyms, drive you nuts. So that's kind of this complexity in there, and how do you get a community group? I heard Justine's plea. How do you get them to navigate through this avalanche of information that comes sort of pouring over them? How do you get someone to help pick their way through that? And then on top of the complexity, you've got uncertainty. This is just untechnical certainty that bedevils all our processes. And I think there was a tendency in the past to use uncertainty as kind of as a reason for doing nothing. It's a bit like trying to stop inflation by banning it. Uncertainty exists. You have to accept it. You have to work out how to make it work for you. But it means for scientists that there is a huge challenge in communicating uncertainty. And I'm going to introduce you to another little tool here, because I can. It's this one. This is, I think this is your invention, isn't it, Ned? Yeah, go on. You take it. And I think we call it the uncertainty matrix. But this is kind of a way, what we're trying to do here, and I'll sort of attempt to explain it, is get those community groups and those community discussions going into a place where they're comfortable with a sort of a world where it's about probabilities rather than certainties, because you're never going to have certainties. So what you've got on this diagram is along the top you've got a number of scenarios, call them development scenarios or whatever, and then down the left-hand axis a series of outcomes, values, whatever you want to think of them, and then the colour codes represent our understanding of likelihood of achievement. So it's a simple matrix. Under that scenario, will we achieve outcome A? So you start with green, which is almost certain, and you go through to red, which is not on your nelly, and in between we use concepts like probably and possibly. Now to some, well, it's honest. It's the honesty of the scientists saying, look, we don't have absolute certainty on this, but we think the odds are pretty good. And I think what we found is that the communities are up, they're up for that sort of discussion. There's another kind of way of communicating uncertainty. This is about the likelihood of achieving a particular TLI score in Waihora, which is an important part of the solutions package. We are representing on a linear scale where any particular scenario might take you. So, in terms of the science process, what are we learning? Well, it's sort of summed up in the first one. You've got to kind of front load this. We've talked about this in collaborative processes. The justification has always been, look, if you put the effort in up front, you get the rewards at the end. You save money, energy, and so forth. It seems to me that science delivery is kind of on a continuum. You got the traditional black box science that Graham was talking about this morning, the trust us, we know what we're doing, here's a number, through to what you might call open science, where you share your knowledge and information, you're still in control, but you're sharing it, making it accessible to varying degrees, through to what we might call fully collaborative co-design science. And I think we're actually in a process of moving along that continuum. And in any individual limit setting process, you're moving somewhere, hopefully from the middle towards the collaborative. That's certainly where we want to go. And in the next limit setting process, which we'll be doing in Canterbury, which is for the Waimakariri zone, we're starting a co-design process right now. I mentioned the importance of the conceptual model, getting early engagement and agreement on that if you can. The importance, because scientists always argue with each other that you bank your agreements when you've got them, so you don't have to relitigate. And then finally, that key role for scientists in terms of integration of knowledge. So those are the science learnings. Now quickly, I just want to say something about consequences, which is actually not really consequences. What I'm saying is, what does implementation look like, I suppose? And there's a lot of stuff I could say because it's something that's vexing us at the moment. How do we deliver on the ground? But I did prepare some slides on this thing, which Linda actually talked about yesterday. And I'm going to say just a couple of things. I reserve the right to do so because if I don't deliver this by August, I won't be standing here or anywhere. Not if the chair has got anything to do with it. So I simply want to mention a couple of things. I won't go into the detail, but the point is that this is an example of collaborative science. And I'll just try and explain that. Linda used a diagram like this, so we don't need to talk about that, which is what it is. Here's my diagram again. Where does the MG fit in our limit setting process? Well, kind of everywhere, really. All of these steps, it's important. It's a multi-stakeholder project. We have all of those partners there who are actively involved in designing the thing, and a number of them are also contributing cash. I don't need to say too much of this except that it's really important that partners own this because this is all about how you codify good management practice, and because good management practice is central to the policy architecture in this zone and other ones in Canterbury, and has also been so much of a feature of the LORF discussion. It's really important that the people who are being asked to operate at good management practice have a pretty old fair say in what it looks like. So that's been really important. It's also been good for getting funding from our point of view. For every dollar we spend, someone else puts in 5, including the government, for which we're eternally grateful. Complex project, so complex structure, lots of governance, lots of different groups, but the importance is having all of the stakeholders there. So, for example, in our governance group, as well as the industry partners, we have Ngāi we have Fish and Game, and by proxy, Forest and Bird. What I was going to say about implementation, very briefly though, was that we are realising as an organisation that this is part of the deal. You know, the community makes all this investment in a collaborative process. The quid pro quo is that they see something out the end. They see things happening on the ground. Something that I guess has challenged us in the past. So in our organisation, having gone through a sort of a reorientation process, shall we say, 4 years ago, we're going through another one that we have slightly more control over. We were saying, what does the organisation look like if it's committed to delivering across 10 zones? A whole bunch of implementation measures. We did an add up of all of the ZIP recommendations across the 10 zones the other day, 943, affecting 150 different organisations and agencies. An annual cost estimate of around about, if you take the infrastructure out, $80 million. Like, where's that going to come from? I mean, the point is that there's a huge appetite out there for change and for action. So we're thinking, how do we make our organisation more effective in delivering that? And how do we work on the leveraging opportunities and the partnerships to make it work? Right, that was a bit of an aside. Just the end. What are we learning about the whole deal? So I guess a number of lessons that are important. I'll leave you to read those, I think. But perhaps just mention this towards the bottom. You see there's one that says embrace the regulatory spectrum, and I think that's an echo of what Rich McDowell was saying yesterday about the mixed model that he was hearing about or was explaining when he was in Europe. You know, that idea that a whole bunch of things that you need to do. It's not just about writing rules. In fact, if you look at the solutions package or the ZIP addendum for Selwyn-Waihora, the recommendations fall into 22 different sort of categories, I suppose. You could break them up that way. 9 of them are regulatory in the sense that they're translated into rules. The rest are about a whole lot of other things. So that's really important. So, last slide. What are we learning? Well, look, you know, we've all said this, it's hard work. It's actually incredibly hard work. It's expensive, it's tiring. You know, we wore David out in only 4 years. It requires a tremendous amount of energy, but you know, the horsepower out there is incredible. You know, the appetite for the community to be involved in this and to contribute and to invest the kind of value that regulatory agencies never could is fantastic. For us, planners and scientists, I said new way of working and thinking, quite fundamental. And I would venture to suggest that we've probably had some staff who've moved on from the organisation because of the relative lack of comfort with working in that kind of way, that area. And the last thing, we haven't really said much about this, but this is kind of really critical, is that the regulatory agency, the authorising agency, if you like, has to share power in this. It has to give the community a sense that what they're doing is worthwhile, will be listened to and will be put into effect. And that brings me to my last C. Thank you.